Hello, please let me see your ticket stubs for the double-edged double bill. Tonight's films feature Brazilian death races. Each week, Adam Thomas and Thomas Mariani will come to the table to discuss the randomly selected yin and yang of a double feature. Then, both will have to pick a number between 1 and 10 in order to seal their fates for the next episode. One will have 2 good movies, the other 2 bad ones. Let the chaos begin. I am Thomas Frankenstein Mariani.
And I am Adam. I am so fucking sorry about Death Race, Thomas.
We'll get into that. This week, as we kind of hinted at, we are doing Death Race 2050 is the bad feature that we're doing. And the good feature is Brazil. The connection between those two being that this is about dystopian future films, because that movie Captive State is coming out this week that we're releasing this, which I'm kind of curious about. It looks interesting. It could go either really boring or underrated like Gem that kind of gets swallowed up in the post-Captain Marvel box office craze.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's about the best of the 2 options we might get.
Right. I mean, it's got Goodman.
Yeah, well, so did the Connors. So
I've heard the Connors isn't too bad compared to the Roseanne revival. But dystopian fiction is interesting because given our modern times, this might be not the most popular genre because it feels maybe too real at points. But I don't mind a good dystopian future story, necessarily. I think they can do an interesting job of reflecting the times that they're currently depicting, and then kind of reflect on how the world has changed in that time since they originally came out, necessarily. So you can pick some of that stuff out that still lingers.
yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think it's a fine genre. There's quite a few that I really like, but there's a lot of bad too, though, man.
That is true. And it fits for our gimmick here, which for those of you who might be listening for the first time, basically, at the end of our last episode, we picked these 2 movies from, we both had 2 films that were either good or bad quality, that we didn't know what they were from each other, except that they were in the dystopian fiction category. And we picked a number between 1 and 10 for each of our choices, and we ended up with Brazil and Death Race 2050. But first, let's go with Brazil.
Do you wake from your finest fantasy only to return to your daily nightmare? Then it's time to break out of your dull, humdrum life and into Brazil.
We're all in this together. We've always been close, haven't we? Yes, Jack. Well, until this all blows over, just stay away from me.
Brazil. It's only a state of mind.
Brazil came out in 1985, December 18th, 1985 in the States, was directed by Terry Gilliam, who most would know as one of the original members of Monty Python, who mostly did like the animation interstitial stuff, and then from there became a very contentious filmmaker, both in terms of audiences and also within the studio system, to say the least, especially with this movie. Had a very infamous sort of production. It was written by Gilliam along with Tom Stoppard, who's a very famous playwright. Obviously, most would know probably Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. And then Charles McEwan, who collaborated with Gilliam a lot more after this, with stuff like Baron Munchausen and The Imaginary of Dr. Parnassus, amongst other things. And I'll admit, this was my pick, and I'm a big Terry Gilliam fan from way back, at least of his earlier works from like the 70s through the 80s through the 90s. I really love so much of his stuff, including this is the middle of his sort of Imagination trilogy, which was preceded by Time Bandits, which people forget was actually a pretty big hit when it came out, which is weird because that movie's very odd, and I don't think it would be a hit at any later time than like 1981 necessarily.
Not,
no. And then he followed this up with The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which was sort of an infamous flop, terrible production that happened. But I personally do love that movie myself. Are you at all a fan of Gilliam?
I wouldn't call myself an uber fan or anything. I think it's very sort of hit and miss with me. Like, I definitely really do enjoy 12 Monkeys. I do like Time Bandits, even though it is just a bizarre fucking time capsule that shouldn't even ever have been made, let alone exist still and made money. I think I've seen Munchausen once. And I'm definitely curious about the Quixote movie that he's supposedly finished, but it's still having problems.
Right, that was sort of his infamous The Man Who Killed Don Quixote production that the Moss and La Mancha, he tried to do it, and then now he finally has a production that was finished, but has had so much trouble getting a release at all, because Amazon dropped out of it and all this other stuff. And to be fair, he's not helping himself with just some of the recent sort of curmudgeon-y comments he's made, especially weirdly sort of defending Harvey Weinstein. Oh, these women that go in with Harvey Weinstein, they know exactly what they were going into, and shit like that. Which is just like, dude, shut the fuck up.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't be saying that.
That's the thing, is Terry Gilliam always wants to be the rebel. Terry Gilliam has that sort of fiery instinct in him that he always wants an enemy. I think what kind of catapulted that was probably ever since, like, Monty Python, The Holy Grail, which was the first feature he directed at all. He co-directed with Terry Jones, and the whole thing was he wanted to make this look like a Pasolini movie. And all the Monty Python guys were like, dude, it's comedy.
Right, exactly. I would almost, like, equate Terry Gilliam to, like, the directing version of, like, Alan Moore. The guy who wrote The Watchmen and everything like that.
Which is interesting, given Terry Gilliam tried to make a version of Watchmen, one of many versions that tend to be made. Yeah.
But no, Gilliam, the problem is, man, I don't know if it's his age, or if he thinks he's more important than he is, or what it is, but he's got that foot and mouth disease all the time. He's constantly just running off at the mouth. I think that might be one of the reasons where I kind of don't follow his work as much.
Has such an abrasive personality. I think it comes from, like, his start being in animation. He had so much singular control. Like, he was by himself doing those animations on Monty Python. So he had such meticulous control over every single detail that he wanted to apply that to directing. And shocker that human beings don't respond as well as, like, cutouts. I think that's what, like, John Cleese and other people have said. Like, shocker that we didn't respond as well. But then again, he does have recurring actors that come in and out, including, in this one, you have, like, Jonathan Pryce, who he'd worked with several times, Catherine Hellman, who recently passed away in between us recording episodes, who pops up in here, Peter Vaughan, amongst other people, who work with him quite often, including another Monty Python member, Michael Palin, in this one.
And he's fantastic in it.
But we'll get into all that. But basically, to get into actually Brazil basically is, imagine 1984, but with a bit more dark humor than George Orwell put in originally. Like, a lot of the satire is still there, a lot of sort of that sharp satiric intent that he had originally is there, but there's definitely a lot more of sort of, like, the sillier Britishisms that Terry Gilliam kind of adopted from Monty Python, which is interesting because he's the only American member of Monty Python. He actually grew up in Minnesota. Interesting fact. We basically follow Sam Lowry, who's our protagonist, who works for Central Services in this dystopian future that's a lot like 1984, where he works for... It's weird. I love the bureaucracy of this movie because it makes these titles so pointless. But he's going to graduate in information retrieval, but he's currently in records. He's in the records department. But he keeps saying, like, no, I don't want to do that, and he has these, like, big flights of fancy. It's kind of almost also like a Walter Mitty story as well, in that regard, where there's a lot of big fantasy sequences that occur. And I personally love this movie. I remember I first watched it, I went through, like, a Monty Python phase in, like, late middle school to early high school, and I also kind of latched on to Terry Gilliam's movies as a result of that. And I love how this movie looks. I love the world that it creates. I watched this before I ever read 1984 in high school, and I sort of like the total cynicism that's going on throughout, and even like the sort of hopefulness, and even like Sam Lowry as a character I think is very interesting and dimensional, and could only be played by Jonathan Pryce. I think Jonathan Pryce is that right mix of being an everyman while also being kind of a sleazy piece of shit at the same time. Yeah. He has that right mix, I don't think, because interestingly, they were trying to do this for a younger character. They were trying to get, like, Tom Cruise, I think, early on. The studio wanted him to, which in 1985 would have been a bad choice. That would not have worked at all. You need somebody who feels like they've been churned out by the system for years. And Jonathan Pryce fits that perfectly, where he's just kind of been in this rut and all this other stuff. But I like that at the same time it doesn't completely absolve him of any sins by being like a dreamer and a wanderer, because he's constantly still fucking over people, and he's been haunted, but he still is just so driven by this one thing of trying to get his dream girl and all this other stuff. I like all of that. But when we were doing our picking last week, Adam, you kind of said you didn't remember liking this the first time you saw it.
Correct.
And now you've revisited it. How do you feel?
I like it more now. I agree with you. I like the look of it, the general aesthetic, all the, the pipes everywhere, and just seeing all the different actors. Like, oh my God, that's Bob Hoskins. Oh, that's Jim Broadbent.
Yep.
Oh, Ian Holm.
Yep.
I mean, it's nonstop. And like I said earlier, Michael Palin just pretty much steals the movie for me. I mean, he's perfect. Nobody else could have played that part. But the movie feels a little long in the tooth for me. It's not a huge running time, but there's parts to it where I'm like, okay, let's get moving a little bit here.
Okay, that's a question, is how long was the version you watched? Because there's a couple different versions of this movie, which we'll get into.
Well, I watched whatever version is on Prime. So I think Prime is the basic theatrical version. So it's a little over 2 hours.
Okay. To be fair, keep in mind, I have the Criterion DVD that has, like, all three of the different versions. And I always go for the Terry Gilliam sort of European cut. That's about 2 hours, 23 minutes. So I think that's slightly longer than your version.
Nope, that's exactly what my length was.
Okay, so that is the official Terry Gilliam approved longest cut. There's also, like, a 132-minute American cut, and then the infamous Love Conquers All studio cut that's 90 minutes long.
But, I mean, there's a lot in this movie to like. There's a lot of little funny bits. Like, I lost my shit both times De Niro ziplined. It's so funny to me.
We're all in it together, kid. For me, with De Niro, it's when he says bloody paperwork, because it's like, De Niro, you can't say bloody. You're not British. This doesn't work at all.
At all. I will agree also with Jonathan Pryce. See, Jonathan Pryce, this is sort of the character with the traits that he's played kind of forever and still continues to play. Even in the Pirates movies as her father, he's still kind of this guy. Kind of wants to do the best, but he's still kind of a sniveling prick, too. I mean, that's just kind of who he is. And he's fantastic, too. I've always liked Jonathan Pryce. And I know there was production problems, so you didn't get much with Kim Grease because her and Gilliam didn't get along or whatever the case. But she needed more.
Upon this watch, the biggest issue I do have is Kim Grease, less in, like, her initially in the very opening scene when she meets up with Jonathan Pryce. I like that stuff, especially. Yeah. Where there's sort of a conflict there. And I think she's fine there. I will say, amongst the people who he wanted originally, like, Kim Grease was not his first choice. He attempted to audition people like Rosanna Arquette, Ellen Barkin, Jamie Lee Curtis, Rebecca De Mornay, Ray Don Chong, Kelly McGillis, Kathleen Turner, and even Madonna at a certain point. This would have been perfect for Curtis, though.
Yeah, I agree. I think Jamie Lee Curtis out of all those would be the best pick. So maybe even a young Ellen Barkin. But you got to figure Kim Grease, they just didn't get along, and she did the best she could, and he chopped the shit out of it. So,
because that especially affects once she comes back to him, and there's that whole stuff where, like, she stays over at his mom's place, and then has the big romantic sort of bed scene. That's where I think the movie really falters, is that whole sequence. Just because I don't quite believe it, but at the same time, the movie's kind of trying to go for, like, a sort of, this is a dream logic overall. And they're trying to kind of... I would hope that, like, in this scenario, he would have leaned more into, this is sort of his fantasy of what he wants. This isn't really reality, but then there's also the dream reality that comes in with the ending and all that other stuff. So that's where I think it falls apart the most.
I agree.
Right there, yeah, because it's just... I don't believe that sort of connection would have developed at this point.
And that quickly, too.
Right. Because she is so much more of, like, a fierce, independent woman, and Sam is a fucking buffoon.
He's a sniveling teenager.
Yep, I really love that whole car chase sequence where he's trying to, like, let's go faster, let's go this way, and it's like, oh, you're just jumping into this, you fucking idiot.
Oh, this is screwing everything up. Yeah, just everything.
Completely.
I did really like the dream sequences. I love the costuming, especially his. I think it's so bizarre and cool. And the giant samurai reminds me of, the last episode.
Right. I could see this being an influence maybe on a young Zack Snyder or Sucker Punch.
Yeah, 100. But that's the thing, too. You watch this movie, and I see influences from this movie all over the place. There are a lot of movies, especially in this genre, that take a lot from Brazil.
Well, yeah, especially just with, like, the production design, which it was nominated for its art direction and its screenplay at the Oscars. You can totally tell, especially, the art direction instantly just reminded me of the Anton Furst designs for the original Batman, the Michael Keaton Batman.
Oh, definitely. 100%.
All the city stuff, all, like, the big doorways and the sort of gothic architecture. have so much of that. But also there's even, what I like about this movie is definitely that it has influences from like a 1984 or even like sort of Ayn Rand with some of like the statue designs as well. That kind of pop up. It's this interesting sort of pastiche of different dystopian fiction that had come before, and then, like I said before, with dystopian fiction in general, would influence so much later. Terry Gilliam, despite, all of his sort of issues, is definitely a guy with a distinct vision, and I love whenever he can, like, actually portray that vision wonderfully, but at the same time, bounce it off of people who can kind of rein him in a bit. With, like, Tom Stoppard's, like, sort of style of actual, like, human interaction, which is something Terry Gilliam rarely actually gets right. I love the recurring joke about Michael Palin having triplets. Oh, how are the twins? Triplets. Oh, how time flies.
Gosh,
Great joke.
He messes up his wife's name. He's just all over the place.
Or, and especially with his daughter, the scene with the little girl, who's actually Terry Gilliam's little girl, and her real name is Holly. So that was not even a purposeful thing. She kept just saying, "I'm Holly," because that's her actual name. And Michael Palin just rolled with it. Genius.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. The fucking mask. God,
the baby mask? Terrifying,
yeah,
yes.
Terrifying, dude. And I think we've mentioned it here before about I'm kind of a fan of bleak endings. Do you get bleaker than this?
Well, we'll definitely need to talk about that, because I also love the ending of this movie so much, because it's definitely, this whole movie, along with being sort of a play in 1984, is Terry Gilliam's total fuck you to major studio films as well.
Obviously.
Because there's definitely, like, Harry Tuttle is the perfect example of, like, typical sort of studio hero everyman. Like, you could see him being played by not just a De Niro, but anybody from, like, a Stallone, a Schwarzenegger. Like, they would definitely sort of play, like, he's the handyman who goes around sort of the hero of the people in this dystopia. It totally feels like that, and the way especially he goes out is also mortifying. It's so simple, but it's really upsetting.
Really, it's totally bizarre, and I guess, too, doing a little bit of research, that, man, did no one like working with De Niro on this.
Well, I mean, because he's super method, so obviously,
method.
But he has such a small part that's just like, did you actually, like, become a handyman? What did you do?
He was down for a week. They had to extend it by another week of shooting. Most scenes were done in 1 or 2 takes. He took like 27 for one scene, and he still forgot his lines. It's like, De Niro, man, get your shit together. That guy's got a lot to prove, though. That's the problem.
I know, right? He's so small, especially at this time. Like, no one knew him.
That's what I'm saying, dude. Like, come on, bro. Get your name out there. Do the work.
He hadn't really sparked until, like, Meet the Parents eventually, right? That's where he really hit big.
Well, Bad Grandpa, I'd say.
Right. The Meet the Parents sort of the soft opening to Bad Grandpa, his magnum opus, that's true.
Yeah, right.
But I do like him at the same time popping in and out. I think he's a great sort of, he's this masculine ideal that Sam wants to be. Every time he pops up, it's just sort of, and especially how that contrasts with, we kind of alluded to Bob Hoskins and Derek O'Connor as the Central Services repairmen that come in. I love when Sam brings up the idea of the form like a B/6, and the one guy is like in a catatonic state, and Bob Hoskins is like, "Oh, motherfucker.
Just hits him with the
we'll come
right?
back. Yeah. We'll get you back."
I always love seeing Bob Hoskins. I am such a big Bob Hoskins fan. He's so good. Even Mario, even though I hate the movie, it's a terrible movie, which, by the way, there's a lot of that, too.
Yes, the design especially did remind me of the Super Mario Bros. And he's wearing a red hat where the bill gets bigger with every scene he comes back for, which is great.
That's so funny. What a classic gag that he just decided to throw in this. Yeah, no, it gets so trippy at the end. Like, the movie's already trippy, but once it gets into, like, his delusion, you're like, what the fuck is going on? Like, as soon as he goes into the funeral home, I'm like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah, that whole ending sequence, for sure. But I wanted to circle back to Michael Palin, who we were referencing earlier, because the genius of Michael Palin here is that he was always on Monty Python. He always played, like, the nicest characters possible, because, admittingly, he's incredibly charming. Like, he made
the shop clerk, dude, in the, the dead parrot. I mean, he's the everyman.
Right, he's the everyman. Especially, I love his post-Python career for the last 20 years has been travel documentaries where he just comes around like, "Hello, I'm Michael Palin. I'm here to be nice to you." That's literally his career of, like, the last 25 years or so. Because he's that just, like, charming and affable. And Gilliam uses that perfectly here. Because he comes off as like, oh, he's your best friend, greatest guy possible. And just how he unveils the fact that, like, oh, wait, what is he doing with, like, the lab coat? And he has blood on him? And then he's a torturer?
Yeah, dude. The lab coat's got like cuts and shreds in it where someone was probably fighting back.
Yep.
Yeah, oh man. And his daughter's sitting there waiting for him. That's how easy it is for him to just do what he does, that his kid is sitting in the other room.
Yep.
While he's probably just horribly mutilating someone.
Yeah, because he cares so much about appearances and being, like, the person in the society who, like, fits in perfectly. And then when he's, like, screaming at Sam, when he, like, uncovers the mic at the end of the movie also, it's like, it's so malicious, it's so just filled with rage. It's such a great transformation for him. It may be his best performance just as an actor in general.
I could agree with that. I think so.
There are also a lot of great people, like we mentioned Katherine Hellman earlier as Sam's mother, is amazing. Just as sort of like this socialite who's going around being very nonchalant about being mutilated to become younger.
I mean, horribly.
Oh my god. The scene where Jim Broadbent is like using her skin like putty is terrifying.
Dude, it's so scary. That image stuck in my head because, you know, this movie came out about 2 years after I was born. And I remember seeing that image in like a magazine or something. And it stuck with me. It's still, like when I saw it, it gives me the shivers a little bit. It's creepy, dude. And it's done so well and effectively, too. Nah, man, I don't want to see this shit. But out of context, it's even scarier. Now that I watched it and I know what it's happening, it's like, it's not that bad. But when I was a kid and saw that, man, it freaked me the hell out. And he basically uses like chip clips to hold her fucking skin back. Like,
and then covers her in saran wrap and it's like, oh, twice as beautiful as she was before.
So bizarre. It's like using paint on her face and it's almost like sexual. And Jim Broadbent as a young man is creepy and weird.
That's true. Yeah, because we're so used to him at least being 40.
Every time I see him, and I know he's been in everything, but every time I see him, I just think of fucking Hot Fuzz for some reason, because he just killed me in that movie so much. You know, great big bushy beard.
Like, especially the contrast between her and, I forgot the character's name, but her friend that keeps coming around, who gets more and more mutilated as well, with like she has more and more bandages, and then eventually to where you were talking about the funeral parlor and like the dream sequence where she's like a fucking bag of gelatinous bones and shit.
Oh, I know, dude, it's so gross. Yeah, and they're constantly trying to set him up with her daughter. And I love that scene too, where he's like, he sits down and he's trying to be really nice about it, to explain to her, like, you know, I'm not into it. And she's like, no, it's okay, I don't like you either. Have the look on his face, like, what do you mean?
That's the most he ever gives a shit about her at all, is when she insults him. Perfect, yeah.
She doesn't even insult him, she just doesn't like him.
There are other great, like, I mentioned Peter Vaughan earlier, who plays Mr. Helpman, who is a sort of warped version of, like, the Wizard of Oz in this movie as sort of the big brother type, where he's this sort of attempting to be literally a helpful persona, given his name, whenever he's on television and whenever he's, like, with Sam, just like, I just want to help you rise up, because I knew your father, and all that stuff. And I like the fact that there's that one scene where Sam sneaks into his office and he sees the picture of his mom on the desk.
Yeah.
Just says everything.
Without... 100%.
Great.
I love the Sam, I need your help. And it shows him shaking him, because he just got done pissing.
Yes. And then another disturbing scene later when he shows up as Santa inside of that cell.
Yeah, so weird.
Can't let the orphans wait.
Oh, you know, during the dream sequence when they were pulling her cage, and like, this is just fucking nightmare fuel. Like 100%.
Well, the whole movie feels like it kind of goes in, but it feels like a weird dream that you would try and describe to somebody after you woke up, and they'd be like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
Right.
Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But I think Gilliam does a great job of making at least the logic of it keep going. Where like the story basically of like he has to have a check from a guy who was executed instead of Harry Tuttle. It was literally like a beetle goes into the typewriter that causes one typo, and it costs the man his life.
Right.
You know, that's such a great satirical point about the bureaucracy of just this horrible environment, and how that just results in like, oh, this check needs to be like taken back, I need to bring this invoice back to this woman, and the scene where like Sam confronts that woman, who's just like, it's so mortifying.
It's terrible. And when she's, you know, what have you done with his body, and she's freaking out. And just his sniveling ass's responses. You know, I didn't have to come all the way here. This was very difficult for me. Go fuck yourself, man.
That's why Jonathan Pryce's performance is so good, because he has enough of an everyman quality to where you don't completely hate him, but at the same time, he is such a, like, buffoon and has this horrible methodology just because of, like, the environment he was raised in, that he just lacks also empathy. at the same time. He's actually being confronted by that, and he's trying to escape both this weird society in terms of, like, just the corporate culture, but also guilt. He's trying to, like, get rid of both of those feelings at the same time, and that's what's ultimately, like, his sinful downfall, is that he's trying to avoid responsibility in either direction, just wants this magical, relationship with her, with Jill, that won't work out. That's what I love, especially as I've grown older, that's become the Sam Lowry character, is really, it's not about escaping just like this corporate system. It's like, no, you're trying to escape that, but also not trying to absolve anything, not trying to help anybody. It's the perfect example of like a complicated dystopian main hero who's not really a hero. He's just a coward.
Yeah. That's what does work about the movie, though, too. He's not a swashbuckler in there to save the day. He is in his dreams. But when it all boils down to it, he's just a regular man trying to do something way beyond his means, his intelligence, his strength, everything. I mean, he just falls apart constantly. He has no idea what to do or what he's doing at basically every second. I mean, to the point where it even starts off with him sleeping in because the electronics failed. Without that, he's completely unreliable. And that's, like I said, that's what makes the movie work. You kind of pull for him. But at the same time, when the ending comes, you're like, this makes sense.
And weirdly, especially this watch, I felt so much more sorry for Ian Holm as his boss.
Me
where
too.
He's obviously like, he's also kind of like a sniveling dude who you would figure, he might be the villain of a different movie. But the tragedy of his character is just that he's completely lost too. Like, he just sits in his office alone, completely distant from all his employees who kind of hate him and just want to watch movies instead of actually work.
Which that's all he wants to do too.
Right. But he has to be like, I'm supposed to be the top man. I know what's going on. Sam, please help. I don't know what I'm doing. Even like in the fantasy sequence when he sort of pops up as like the stone sort of golem character coming to try and stop Sam, he's like, Sam, don't go. There's almost weirdly, I don't know if this was intended, but almost kind of like an attraction almost between, I think, an Ian Holm that Sam wouldn't reciprocate. I kind of felt.
Maybe. I mean, I can kind of see that, but I kind of see it as more or less like Sam might have been in a weird way, his friend to him, like his only friend, the only one he would, that he could actually have human interaction with on any other level. But again, Gilliam is so chock full of subtext. Gilliam movies,
right?
I mean, who the hell knows? You could watch this movie another 5 times and still pick up something new.
Right. I didn't really realize until this watch, but the moment where he goes into information retrieval in his new office, and his neighbor buddy, who's Charles McEwen, the co-writer. I love the fact that I realized that desk is there in the middle. As a kid, I was just like, "What?" That this is like a funny gag. But the realization was like, they're so fucking cheap, even at this higher level, that they have two guys shared the same desk in 2 completely different offices.
I know. And it's so funny because even like the poster in the background is cut off right down the middle.
Right. And he's also very funny, too, especially the whole bit with the computer where he's like, I'm a whiz with this. I know how to do this. Oh, it's broken. You haven't turned it on.
Right. It's like one finger. Click. Click. I mean, to the point where he even falls asleep and then he prints him out the information he already has.
Right. But we should definitely get into the sort of weird production, and then, as a result, the ending of the movie was the biggest sort of controversial point with the sort of American release of this through Universal. Fox released it internationally, and they got most of the budget put up for this. But the American release was handled by Universal, and Terry Gilliam infamously sort of had a bout with Sid Sheinberg, who ran Universal at the time. Also, the husband of Lorraine Gray, who was the wife in the Jaws movies.
Oh, no shit.
Yeah, that's why she got that role. She's also very talented, actually.
Yeah, she's not terrible. But,
no.
I mean, yeah.
So Sid Sheinberg was very adamant about, like, this is not commercial at all. We need to cut this down severely, and we need to change the ending to be a happy one. And Gilliam was obviously against that, and there were so many big battles that literally resulted in, like, they both took out variety ads where they were going back and forth about this. I love Terry Gilliam went to USC, who invited him, like, hey, can you do a talk with the students? And he's like, oh, sure, let me bring an audiovisual aid, which is my entire cut. And he actually was, like, fighting with the studio executives in the classroom during the lecture before the movie, because they found out about it. And eventually what got the movie to be released as he wanted it to be was that the LA critics were at one of those screenings that he did for a college, and ended up voting it, like, best film of the year.
That makes sense.
Right. which is why he ended up getting released in the version he wanted, though there is a Love Conquers All cut that severely edits the movie down to 90 minutes and was on TV in some markets. And, you know, admittingly, Sid Sheinberg at least had a point that, like, this is not a commercial movie at all.
No, at all. And I think the box office speaks to that.
Right. Where, to be fair, what I have here is that it made $10 million in the United States off a $50 million budget. The European numbers apparently aren't available, though it was way more of a success, obviously, over there in its original cut. I mean, I get it in terms of, like, it would be, you know, necessarily hard to sell this to a main audience, and probably trying to, as you mentioned, maybe cut it down to something a bit more malleable. But even Gilliam said at the time, like, look, I had screenings of this, and I know some people aren't going to like it. But at the same time, I had this movie, and I want to release it the way that I want to release it. And it's that weird thing where, like, this is kind of what I'm talking about, where he sort of had a villain in this case with Sid Sheinberg, and I think in any other production, he always wanted to see some villain he could fight against, no matter what. And I think that's kind of what turned him into the guy he is now, the bitter old curmudgeon. And I just don't think, you know, you don't necessarily need that in every production just because you had it that once. That sort of ego and inflated persona that he has doesn't need to be with every production. Even, you know, I mean, he also had that with, like, it's weird with that Harvey Weinstein defense I referred to earlier, considering Brothers Grimm, he fought with them constantly about, like, cuts and budget and all that other shit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, I think it's more or less he just wants to have an adversary at all times. If he has an adversary who wants to cut his movie, so he does the cut of their movie, and it doesn't work, then it's their fault. If they don't cut it, then maybe the studio should have stepped in. I mean, either way, he comes out smelling like roses. Mm-hmm. I mean, he really does. Right.
But at the same time, you can agree that this version, for maybe some of the pacing issues, is still the only version that can probably exist in this movie. This is the best version.
Yeah, this is the best version. There's no question. The first time I saw it was the hour-and-a-half version. And I was completely, like, not necessarily lost, but, well, probably, because I was pretty young. I'm like, what the hell did I just watch? But no, this version, if you're going to watch it, I mean, it has to be the Terry Gilliam version.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, because you lose so much of, like, especially that whole ending sequence we're talking about, where we have this whole scenario set up of, like, oh man, Sam's stuck in a pickle, he can't get out of the scenario, and then Robert De Niro just comes in and saves him, and then horribly gets suffocated by paperwork. And then Sam ends up riding off in the sunset magically with Jill, and they're all live happily after. And it turns out that he's been tortured to the point where that's the world he exists in now. He's really
lost his mind.
Yep, and he's in that chair, and they can't torture him anymore, but he's also just permanently in, like, a coma that he can't get out of.
Mm-hmm. Just humming the theme.
Right, which we should mention uses the Brazil, the actual song, throughout the score, which, credit to, I love Michael Kamen's score in this movie.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's operatic, it has, like, waltz elements, it also has, like, great sort of noir jazz moments, too, like when he's walking around. I love the score in this, too, but it's such a great ending to where he's this guy who constantly fantasized, couldn't get out of his fantasy, and now he has this perfect ending of he's stuck in his fantasy, except he's in a catatonic state and can never get out of that.
Yeah. I wouldn't even go, it may be bittersweet. Maybe. It's pretty dark. But again, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted this to end any other way. It's a perfect ending to this movie. Like, he doesn't win. You can't win. The problems are too big for one guy.
Yes, and that at the end of the day, you'll be just swallowed up in the horrible corporate culture that has existed for ages, and you can't really fight against it. Have a good night, everybody. Throw away your popcorn bags on your way out.
Right. Thanks for coming out. Enjoy your piece of pie at the diner after the movie.
But yeah, it's the only ending that works for this, just because that's the coward's way out, basically. Yep. That's the only way he could really have any kind of a happy ending. And I think it's what really makes it Terry Gilliam's most overall, like, perfect vision, I think, for a movie. Because some of his other movies definitely have, like, weird compromises or weird just limitations of budget or certain actors or anything else. Whereas this, I think, is the perfect consolidation of, like, all of his sort of visual style, his use of actors, great performances all around, and wonderful production design that, as you mentioned, is so influential from here on out. And especially if you've been kind of turned off from Gilliam, from maybe some of his comments, or just sort of the perception like all of his movies are too buck wild, I would weirdly say this is probably one of his more mainstream movies. It's like this and Time Bandits.
Yeah, I think this is one of his more restrained.
Right, or 12 Monkeys, obviously. 12 Monkeys was his biggest hit. And
yeah, 12
much
Monkeys
more
is biggest hit,
conventional.
but there's part in 12 Monkeys where you're like, what the fuck?
Right, but imagine that times... This is about that times at least, like, 2 or 3.
This stays in the world it's in for the most part, other than his dreams, which are clearly dreams.
Right.
Where 12 Monkeys, they're just kind of like, is he dreaming? I don't know. Leave it up to you.
Yeah. And for all that, it's one of my favorite movies ever, but I'll just say that as my final thoughts. So your final thoughts, Adam, on Brazil?
I think it's a good movie. I think just to see it, to see the influences that have spawned because of it, and the set design and the artwork and the matte paintings and all those things. I mean, it's just everywhere in cinema, especially in the genre. I do feel it's a little long in the tooth in certain parts, but other than that, I mean, it's chocked full of great performances, and it's a good story. I can appreciate a story where the lead, protagonist is incredibly flawed, and he's really flawed. He's a sniveling prick, but you halfway root for him, and I can get behind that because that's closer to reality than anything else. So I think it's definitely worth a watch.
And now to transition to maybe a less elaborate production than Brazil, we have the Roger Corman production, Death Race 2050.
My fellow citizens of this great country of ours. Now this is all about freedom. The freedom to sit on your big, fat ass all day and watch the singly greatest sporting event known to man. Welcome to the Death Race.
Are you ready?
Let's score these fuckers.
So, Death Race 2050. This is, as I mentioned, a Roger Corman production. It is technically a sequel to Death Race 2000, which was the film he also produced back in 1976, right? 75, 76?
76, 75, somewhere around there.
Right, his sort of exploitation film. And not to be confused with the remake and its several sequels that have come out since 2008, the Jason Statham one.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, this was your pick, so why don't you start off the discussion about Death Race 2050?
Oh, fuck. Okay, well, I picked it blind. I hadn't seen it. Well, that's not true. I saw half of it. I never finished it. I'm kind of just an odd fan of the Statham one, just because it's terrible, but I'm like, it's Jason Statham, so it's kind of enjoyable. And the original I've seen before with Carradine and Stallone. So I'm like, man, I got to give this one another watch. It's like one of the newer, if not the last, Roger Corman produced movie. And Roger Corman is, a pretty big staple. And fuck me. I don't know where to start with this one. I was offended in so many different ways.
Calm down.
What kind of debt does Malcolm McDowell have?
I mean, it's probably a combination of debt and also that he probably pissed off a lot of people in Hollywood when he had, like, the chance to be a star. Like, after Clockwork Orange, that dude probably had the potential to be a much bigger star than he ended up being, and he just, I think, pissed off a lot of people.
I mean, I guess. But other than him and, like, Manu Bennett from Arrow and the Spartacus show, they're the only recognizable guys in it, and nobody cares in this movie.
Here's what I'll say, is that Malcolm McDowell definitely does not care.
Yeah, no, at all.
He does not care whatsoever. But I would argue everyone else cares, maybe just that care is completely misguided and dialed up to 11.
Yeah, I'd say maybe Bert Grinstead as Jed Perfectus really cares.
Right, he really cares, and I would argue didn't mind him necessarily as much as I think it's the role is weird, because, alright, for me, I mentioned at the end of our last episode, I had not seen anything Death Race related prior to this week. Right. I knew of Death Race 2000 and the remake, but I just never seen any of that stuff. And so I actually watched the original Death Race 2000, the Jason Statham remake, and then this one, and I will say, with those three movies, the first one, first of all, is a great sort of 70s drive-in movie. Mm-hmm. In terms of just the basic concept is, it's the distant year of 2000. Which, always great. Not predicting the future quite right. Excellent. And in this world, the main sort of entertainment is this death race, in which racers race all across the country, and the big incentive is for them to murder people on the road, which will drive up their points. I believe it's the adults are about 10, babies are like 20, and old people are like 80.
Yeah, something like that.
Right, and the main sort of star of this, the biggest racer, is Frankenstein, played in that one by David Carradine, who's this guy who's been in so many horrible crashes that has like limb transplants and like a robotic arm. Great. Totally cheap, but perfect for that movie. Awesome. And that first one is actually, I didn't know this until I watched it here, is directed by Paul Bartel, who's someone we talked about previously, who's been in like Joe Dante movies and a lot of Roger Corman movies, for sure. And he directed that one. He also plays the Doctor early on in that movie. And that one has a great mix of sort of his satirical intent with very abrupt but punctuated violence, where like when people get run over, it's very quick because they don't clearly have the budget to make it look extravagant, but it is effective in terms of like when the murders happen, they're quick and jolt you immediately. And it helps that, like you mentioned, you have great personalities in there, like the rival Machine Gun Joe, played by Sylvester Stallone, pre-Rocky, in a great turn.
Yeah, no, he's fantastic, and he looks great.
Right. And then the Jason Statham one was a bit more of just like, it's more of like people race around and death can occur, but it's not about murdering people as much as like if you stop or you end up losing the race, you end up getting murdered, basically. In that one. And I think that one's kind of fun for what it is. It's one of the better Paul W.S. Anderson movies, which isn't saying a lot.
No, that's saying nothing, but yeah, I definitely agree with you.
It emphasizes way more on the racing in there, but the racing sequences are pretty fun. And of course, Statham, as you mentioned. Also, Joan Allen's so great as the villain in that movie.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
She's Ellen barking it up.
Oh, yeah. Big time. Yeah.
Perfectly. And Jason Clarke's also there's like the asshole security guard guy. That one, it's not a great movie, but it's a fun little B movie for what it is.
It's a good Statham movie.
Right. It's a good example of like the higher budget, especially Jason Statham movies. And then I think the problem with Death Race 2050, which I don't think I hate as much as you do necessarily, the trouble is just that in the original there's a lot more authentic, like sort of grime and grit, that even the Jason Statham one kind of replaced with at least really cool-looking cars and a more effective sort of world-building with its bigger budget. This one wants to build the sort of same world and story, come to that same one as the Death Race 2000, but it just doesn't have the talent or the budget at all to do that. And they use a lot of green screen, and they try and have the actors put so much personality into it, and it never quite works with most of them. I thought, actually, I liked Manute Bennett and also his navigator. Yeah, Marcy Miller. I thought they were fine as sort of like a lead. They honestly made it far more bearable than it could have been by comparison. It's just that a lot of the personalities around them are just like very flat one-joke stereotypes for most of it. Like there's the rapper Minerva, whose literal rap is like kill, fuck, or whatever the hell it is. It's
drive, kill, fuck, kill.
Right, and
oh, good.
And there's the Jamie Presley wannabe, who's like this weird cult leader that like has various mixes of like Christianity and Islamic ideologies and all this other stuff. And they make a joke, I guess, out of that, where it's like, oh, she has a very confusing ideology, but also, what is the joke? It's just that it's just an excuse to have like any kind of different like, oh, look, here's a suicide bomber, here's a cult that, like, willingly gets run over by her, all this other stuff. It packs so many ideas into there where, like, Frankenstein and, like, Machine Gun Joe and some of the other, like, racers that were in the original movie, they had, like, one gimmick. And it was simple, effective, they didn't overplay it. Versus this movie overplays the fuck out of pretty much everything.
Yeah, dude, and I mean, it's just chocked full of CGI blood and gun, muzzle flashes and explosions and smoke. And I mean...
And even the few practical effects that are in there are terrible. Like, there's a guy who gets, like, bisected, and it's the worst combination of bad CG blood followed by a subpar trauma, like, bottom half that keeps bleeding out.
Oh, 100%. It looks like it's made out of paper mache.
Right. And they just overemphasize on that, and what, like I said, the charm of the original Death Race was they knew how much of their budget they could work with, and they cut immediately so that you didn't notice that shit. Versus this one loves to linger on it. Like, any of the gore sequences, any of, like, the offensive jokes, it just feels like they're, like, nudging you about it. And that just feels a lot more like you're trying way too hard.
Right, and I think ultimately that's my problem with the movie. They're trying so hard to be like, look, we're satirizing this, and, oh my god, look how gory we are. Oh, here's some nudity for no reason. Hey, we got Malcolm McDowell with silly hair. Isn't that cool? This movie doesn't work for me on any level. And I mean any level. I find it an offensive piece of shit, both on screen and to my senses. The soundtrack, the fucking, just the horrible CGI, the horrific acting, just, I can't do this. This is easily my least favorite movie that has been picked for a bad one. By miles.
Man, I still say The Crowning Jewel is fucking Wired.
I still think this is worse.
Well, because for me, I would not go that far. I think it's bad, but I think there's a few interesting things that I at least kind of latched onto, maybe out of desperation at a certain point. Mm-hmm. But, like, my favorite of sort of any of the racer characters is actually, there's a AI racer. I think it's Keb, and it's a self-driving car who has, like, an existential crisis about, like, what am I? I am a machine.
Was funny. Like, they could have gone somewhere with that. I will agree with that. That was a decent idea.
Right, and there's funny sequences with him. Like, there's a bit where he goes up to, like, a random wooden statue, and she's like, "Miss, I am low on fuel. Can you please fill me up? I have no arms or legs." And he's just like, and he runs her over. He's like, "I will run you over if you don't do that," and then runs him over. It's like, "We could have been friends. I have no friends." Like, I wish they did way more with that. That's such a cool idea, honestly. And it just really uses a Deus Ex Machina later. Or even there's some clever, like, nods and winks at stuff that I kind of like the scene where Marcy Miller goes over and is talking with that particular racer, Minerva, at the bar, and it's the Bechdel bar. And they actually have a Bechdel test-approved conversation. And it's actually a genuine moment between those two characters where Minerva isn't a stereotype. She's actually trying to have a person, right? And they actually have, like, a bit of a moment later, and she gets to kind of be a badass talking to the, like I said, the Jamie Presley wannabe later on, but it just feels like too little too late at the same time for that character at that point. That just felt like, oh, hey, we wanted to throw this in and actually make her a character 15 minutes before the movie ended. And honestly, you know what? I will say that I think it ends on an interesting note that I was surprised was somewhat clever for me. Where basically the ending bit involves Frankenstein talking to the VR camera set that the navigators have in this world. Every driver has a navigator, and they have a VR set, masks at their homes who are unemployed to just be completely sucked into the death race and sit right next to the racer. I love that Frankenstein gives this speech and runs over Malcolm McDowell. Make the future you want to have. And what every one of those people does is they do get up out of their chairs and they do actually go out, but it's to have massive chaos just happen and basically end civilization. I thought that was actually a surprisingly clever note for the movie to end on. That stuff was enough to at least make it not be my least favorite we've ever done for the show, but also it still doesn't redeem the movie. It's still a bad movie that doesn't know what it's doing overall. But there's enough clever ideas to where I'm like, I could see somebody take this and make it a lot better, but it still feels like a first draft. A very early draft that is so malleable and not well connected at all.
This feels like a fan-made sequel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It definitely does feel.
It looks like a fan.
Yes, particularly with how badly Malcolm McDowell is CG'd in with like green screen, so terrible. And then
Yancey Butler, why is she in this?
Yeah, I don't know. She's trying to play off a character who was in the original movie, who is a lot more interesting, where she's a resistance fighter that ends up nearly killing her niece, who was the navigator, and all this political upheaval that's going on. It's a lot more, it's still over the top in that original movie, but it at least feels like they had a point.
Right. And the thing is, the original, it had a point, but it was a very small point to make, but they still did it. This one, they just aped the original's point and then just ignored it.
Yeah, it's way more of a remake of the original than a
100%.
sequel.
Yeah, I mean, way more of a remake.
Down to, they do a much lesser version of my favorite gag in the original movie, where he's about to run over all the old people, and then he runs over all the nurses who put him out there in the middle of the road, but this time it's with, like, kids at a children's hospital.
Yeah, kids in wheelchairs.
Right. And you know what, in that original version, they're actually on a large city street, and it looks like they rented out that entire city street to have, like, this entire sequence happen, which for a Roger Corman movie, that's a pretty big, impressive stunt.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Right, versus in this one, it's at, like, a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, where, of course, a children's hospital would be.
With some building behind them that could be a hospital, but could also be, like, a library, or, a plastic factory. It could be anything.
Some rich person's house they rented for the week.
Exactly.
It definitely feels like it's so subpar in that way. What I like about the original is how it mixes that sort of satiric intent with genuinely, like, kind of enthralling racing sequences that aren't over the top huge, but at the same time, it's tactile. All these cars are on this, like, big abandoned highways. It builds more of a world than in this. There's, like, literally a race sequence where it's a bunch of the racers going around, and it's, like, on one very small street. That's terrible. It looks so cheap even for a Corman production. I think that just might be, unfortunately, Corman's lack of sort of name recognition at this point.
I think so, other than like just underground recognition. Yeah, because I mean the budget is, was there a budget for this movie?
I couldn't find it. I'm sure.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
It was his pocket change, I'm guessing.
It couldn't have been more than $1 million.
Probably not, no.
I'd say even at best $1 million. Probably we're talking $500,000.
And half of that, whatever it was probably for Malcolm McDowell.
Oh, yeah, maybe. Or they just got him lunch and gave him a bed to sleep in. Who the hell knows what's going on with that guy?
Let me make things perfectly clear. Right. I need at least a cot and fish and chips at lunch.
I need a weighted blanket so I feel secure at night. But it's just... Fuck, man. The cars look so cheap and stupid in this. Mm-hmm. Like, to be fair, they did in the original too, but it was also 1975.
What I like in the original movie, it almost feels like it's the most demented version of, like, Wacky Races, where the cars are very silly and cartoonish, but also at the same time, they have a distinct style that also works. This feels very random. Even the Jason Statham movie, they basically kind of did, like, all the cars feel almost like they're second-tier Mad Max cars.
Yeah,
in a good way.
They look like Twisted Metal cars.
Right, yes. Twisted Metal is a really good example, too. Because I think Death Race could work as a new concept. I wouldn't mind if someone were to try and do something more similar to, like, the Roger Corman version that's more satiric and a bit more gory. But I think what you would need almost, and this would never happen, but I'd almost want, like, a Speed Racer level budget where you're able to do just crazy shit with the cars. Where it almost feels like it's a fucking Hot Wheels movie, but with gore.
Yeah, I could see, and you know what, that would actually be enjoyable. Compared to this.
Yeah.
Which I did not find enjoyable at all.
No.
This was a real slog to get through, dude.
It doesn't help. It's also about 20 minutes longer than the original version, which is a mistake.
Yeah, and you feel those 20 minutes, too.
The original version is only about, like, 79 minutes. It's barely theatrical length, but because it knows when to go in, go out. It doesn't have... The premise doesn't need more than that, really.
Right, they know what you're wanting to see.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the point of the movie is these guys in crazy cars mowing down pedestrians trying to win a race. That's the point of the movie. This, with the Resistance, who gives a shit, with the Jed Perfectus guy, where he's, like, might be a closet homosexual, but he might not be. I mean, just how offensive that even is to how he acts. Women slapping, sex stuff. There's no need for any of it.
The satire feels a lot more like this is the example of, like, what people usually, like, the worst fans of South Park get wrong about South Park.
Right.
That's kind of what this feels like. Just you want to be satirical, but you're just kind of, like, trying to push edges without any point to it.
Yeah.
Ultimately, yeah. It feels, like we said, so unstructured, so mealy, so awkward. I will give the Jed Perfectus guy that he had one of the few jokes I actually laughed at. There was a point where his navigator compliments Frankenstein, and he's like, "How dare you say that? Oh, it's still in the air. I can't believe it." And he, like, waves away like it's a fart. Once again, maybe out of Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah, I think it had to be.
No, I think it had to be at a certain point. But you know what? Let's go into our final thoughts then on Death Race 2050, Adam.
This is, like I said, my least favorite movie we watched. I find it offensive on every possible level. This was one of the hardest movies for me to watch from beginning to end. I found myself getting up to use the bathroom and not pausing it. I find, just like, I don't care. I did not care within 20 minutes. I watched the whole thing and I find myself dumber for having done it. There's a big fat no on this one for me.
For me, it's more just like a skinny no. It's like, no,
okay.
I don't like it. It's a shame because I think, especially with so much time between obviously this one and the original Death Race, I think you could have made something very relevant for the times. Something that could have, like, updated a lot of the silly sort of concepts that, like I said, didn't need to be, like, a scathing political satire, even, like, something like Brazil lurches on. And I think it had certain points where I thought they kind of edged toward that in interesting ways. Like I mentioned, the AI car or even the ending, I thought those were clever concepts that I think if you had either a bigger budget or better talent or even just a few more passes at that script to, not rush out a Roger Corman production like he does, I think you could have had an interesting political satire for the modern age that's also like a silly, fun, gory B-movie. And I don't think it really satisfies on either level, ultimately. Despite, I think everyone's trying. I think, like I mentioned, Manu Bennett and Marcy Miller are fine leads who I think get you through most of this movie better than you would expect. But it's still ultimately just kind of a wasted opportunity. I would say it's not quite the worst one.
Agree to disagree.
And on that pessimistic, bitter note, that is the end of our discussion on dystopian fiction films. Before we do our picking for next week's topic, which we'll do at the very end of the show, we have some closing notes to do. First, we got some feedback from all of you out there over at the Facebook page and Twitter page, which is at DEDBpod. We ask every Monday before we record these episodes about what's your favorite and least favorite in whatever topic that we're doing. For films, and we got a few people in reference to their best and worst dystopian fiction films. First, we got James Rodriguez, who says, Children of Men remains one of my favorites, from the phenomenal long takes to how frighteningly relevant it is in this day and age. The scene where the fighting stops in the war zone always leaves me in tears. I also have to love The Lobster, a blackly humorous satire on relationships and how far we go for love. As for least favorites, Babylon AD is the result of Children of Men being given a lobotomy, and Gamer is less interesting than the premise sounded. Then there's Battlefield Earth, which is more off-putting of Scientology than the Going Clear documentary could have been. Anna Robertson Emmy says Looper as one of her favorites. Brian Kane says, the game Half-Life 2 did a great job at enveloping you into a bleak alien-occupied planet. Snowpiercer is as bleak as dystopian fiction gets. Remember the movie Branded? What a hilariously bad movie. Not as crazy as it once seemed, though. Elwood Tiberius, who is at Elwood_Tiberius on Twitter, said Starship Troopers was too damn prescient about what happens post 9/11. Children of Men as well did that. And as far as ones that suck, I haven't seen too many. Probably a YA property about how love is outlawed or something. And then a friend of the show, Dan Chambos, said, Warriors of the Lost World and the FP are my favorites, lol. And then Rachel Hillis also said, favorites, probably Snowpiercer and the Hunger Games films. Least favorites, the first Purge movie, the chronological one, not the movie titled The First Purge. Which I will second her, honestly, on the first Purge is actually the only good one of those. The most recent one.
Yeah, no, that's actually, I agree. The rest are kind of shitty.
Well, it's weird. I think they progressively were getting better. Where, like, the first one is a complete waste of that premise on a bad home invasion movie.
Yeah, it goes in reverse order.
Right. The second movie is, like, a very bargain bin version of a John Carpenter movie.
Yep.
The third movie is an over-the-top satire, but at least has more of a point than any of the previous ones do. Uh-huh. And then the fourth one is actually a pretty good scathing satire of especially sort of, like, how...
like race relations and things.
Yes. Yeah, and...
I agree.
And even it has, like, similar issues with, like, green screen. Any of the scenes with Marissa Tomei are terrible in that movie.
Yeah, wow.
They're really bad. But it's much better than any of those other previous ones. I would definitely, if you want to see one Purge movie, that one.
Yeah, and you don't have to see the other ones in order to enjoy that.
Because it's a prequel, technically.
Right.
Any of those other ones spark your fancy, Adam?
Well, Looper, I like and I hate.
Mm-hmm.
There's just things about Looper, like when they're at the diner and Joseph Gordon-Levitt sitting there with Bruce Willis, and he's like, time travel. How do you time travel? Doesn't matter how I time travel. It doesn't make any sense to you. It's all whatever. Like, wait a minute. Yeah, it's a movie about time travel, and you did not give a second thought of how you did it. Like, I just felt that was kind of important. I didn't need, like, a scene with dudes in white coats, experimenting, but anything. Joseph Gordon-Levitt's contacts.
I really like Looper, but my biggest issue is how they felt they needed to completely manipulate his face with makeup to badly look like Bruce Willis. That does not... That didn't hold up at the time and doesn't hold up now.
Because he did it in the acting. He was great as young Bruce Willis.
Yes.
Just the way he acted. No, I agree with you. The makeup's the biggest travesty. I love Children of Men.
It's an amazing fucking movie.
Easily Clive Owen's best.
Well, yeah, because that was sort of peak. Like, it was that and Shoot 'Em Up were, like, right after each other. I'm like, oh, man, he's gonna be great. That didn't happen.
Nothing. I mean, I even liked him in Sin City. I thought he was awesome.
Yes, true. Exactly. Yes.
But then it's like, nothing happened with him. Like, he did that Killer Elite, and Shoot 'Em Up was a huge bomb.
No, it wasn't. It's a shame, because that's a fun-ass movie.
I hated it when I first saw it. I like it now. But no, I really like that. Starship Troopers, I love. I've always loved it. It's schlocky fun.
I recently rewatched that. I've been going through some of Verhoeven stuff, and I love Starship Troopers. And that was when the first time I watched it, I was kind of more in the camp of like, oh man, it feels like, many critics at the time kind of felt this way, of like, oh man, Verhoeven, like, he's lost his touch. This feels way less intentionally satirical. And it's like, oh no, it is, because he fucking hates his stupid, awful teen actors in that movie.
Yep.
And especially with like Neil Patrick Harris and all the Nazi imagery that happens in that movie, it is so scathing and remarkable. Not my favorite Verhoeven, but one of his better ones.
No, me neither, but yeah, I agree. I haven't seen Warrior of the Lost World or FP.
I've seen Warrior of the Lost World as an MST3K episode, which was funny. But the FP, the FP is like, it's a weird low budget.
Yeah, I know what it is. It's like
right.
a DDR movie, like by Trost or whatever. I know the sequel just came out. It's just I haven't even gotten around to it. It's not that I'm against it. Just I haven't been able to watch it, so I haven't.
I don't remember liking it that much at the time.
Oh, okay.
When I did see it,
Snowpiercer's dope.
Very underrated movie as well. That's a really fucked up, weird. Also, the influence from like Brazil and Gilliam definitely is felt with Snowpiercer.
Oh, yeah. Snowpiercer is dope. My favorite Chris Evans performance.
Oh, he's so great.
He's so fucking good in that.
Yep.
I love Snowpiercer.
He has a monologue that in any other hands would be so stupid.
That's so effed up.
Yep.
And I honestly don't give two fucks about the Hunger Games movies.
Yeah, I mean, the only one I liked was the second one, the Catching Fire.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was the best sort of exploration of what they were trying to do. Honestly, those movies should have just been all Stanley Tucci.
Yeah, right.
I would kill for a spin-off about Stanley Tucci's announcer character. Which we didn't even...
first one, that was enough.
Right. Which we didn't even talk about in Death Race 2050, how much they emphasize on, like, trying to do, like, those announcers.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. He's Stanley Tucci and she's Elizabeth Banks.
Right, the two announcers are, and they're very poor imitations of both them. Because you can't duplicate Tucci, the girl on fire!
Right.
Great. just watch any supercut of all of Stanley Tucci in those movies.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian King mentioned Branded. Branded is a fascinating movie I'd love to talk about on this show.
I've never even heard of it.
It's a movie about basically this world where we're completely surrounded and covered in ads everywhere in the city. And they start coming to life. And it makes no sense. It's made by, like, I believe a Croatian filmmaker and translated the script to English. And it's got fucking Max von Sydow in it.
What?
It's weird. I would love to cover that on the show.
Now I
at
gotta
some
see
point.
it.
Well, that's a back pocket one for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you for all that feedback there. We did also have some feedback in regards to some of our last few episodes. A friend of the show, Dan Chambos, said, for our last episode about female action heroes, he said, in terms of quality, best Hunger Games, worst Resident Evil, due to it being run to the ground. Guilty pleasure, Underworld. Those Underworld movies are just stupid fun and she kicks ass.
Unfortunately, I can't disagree with him. I didn't see the last Underworld movie where she's blonde for whatever the fuck reason. Although what was it, the third one where she came back? Was that the third one?
It's weird. I've only seen the last Underworld movie, but I've seen every Resident Evil movie. I saw Underworld Blood Wars, and that one was fun for even how terrible it was. It has one of my favorite moments involving a female villain, in which the female villain forces one of her henchmen to eat her out, and she clenches her ass in defiance. It's a great moment. I love the villain in that movie. That movie is a lot of fun, I would say. Blood Wars, but then again, I have not seen any of the other ones. I don't know if those are similarly fun.
They're worth it. Yeah, they're fun. I would say they're fun. The Resident Evil movies are terrible.
Some of them I like. I really like the third one, which is the one directed by the Highlander guy, the one where they're in Vegas.
Yep. Yeah, Apocalypse, I think.
That one, and I liked the fifth one, I think it is. It's the one where Mila Jovovich is going through all these weird virtual simulations of like what her old life used to be, and Michelle Rodriguez comes back after the first movie.
I hated it.
I thought that one was kind of fun, especially that's the one with the most Whisker, who I think is the most charmingly stupid thing about any of those movies.
Oh, I agree. Dude, talk about filling out your clothes. He's so muscled. He's just gonna burst through that leather.
Yep.
It's insane.
And he talks like this, Alice.
Welcome.
But all those other ones, are varying degrees of unwatchable. Especially the last one was really terrible.
I've literally started and stopped it, I think 4 times.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, I gotta watch it. I've seen them all. I can't do it.
Yeah, for sure. And then we also had some feedback just in reference, speaking of that episode, we also had RRonR2, which is at RRon007, said, I just want to thank Double Edged Doubleville for reminding me of Haywire and how awesome it is.
Well, you're welcome, Aaron.
Raron.
You're right, Raron.
Raron. And then also, this is one of a few examples we got that just kind of repeated. Lance Langford, friend of the show, who was also on the Horror Returns podcast, saying, Sucker Punch gets shit on all the time, but I love it. And this Oliver Sloan, who also had feedback from our last episode of Loyal Fan, also said he reiterated that it's misunderstood. And you had a bit of a conversation with Lance.
So this fucking guy, right? he sends me a message saying that his podcast is going to do an offshoot episode on Sucker Punch if I'd like to join. And like a butt vagina, I'm like, yeah, sure, I'd love to be on it. Well, it turns out he was just fucking with me. So I took the bait. Then I called him a bastard or whatever. But then he proceeds to tell me how wrong I am, and that Sucker Punch is a great movie, and that he can't believe that I hate it as much as I did, and that we, quote, diarrhea shit all over it. And then I'm like, hey, man, you can like it. A lot of people do. Even if nobody likes it, you're entitled to. It's my opinion. It's Thomas's opinion. We don't enforce it upon anybody. You can like the steaming pile of shit that is Sucker Punch.
We didn't enforce anything upon our guest Sarah, who also hated it.
Who saw it for the first time and fucking hated it.
With fresh eyes, she thought it was garbage.
Exactly. And talk about coming from a complete different perspective. So, yeah. Fuck you, Lance.
But go listen to The Horror Returns. It's a fun show.
I don't know if I'm going to promote their show.
Adam's insisting we don't promote the show anymore. We want to thank all of you for all the feedback, regardless of how constructive or not it was. And we want to also thank Chris Oliver for the intro and outro music used on the show. Listen to more of his music at chrisoliver.bandcamp.com. Also, thanks to Emily Scarta for the art used in her show. She accepts commissions at fiverr.com/EEScarta. We also are on, as I mentioned, Facebook and Twitter at DEDBpod, and also we have a Gmail account at doubleedgedoublebill@gmail.com, where you can send feedback to. It's all spelled out there. And you can also follow me at my own individual Twitter account. I am at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I do writing for reviews and such at marianithomas.wordpress.com. I'll probably have a Captain Marvel review out there as of when we're recording this. And you can also find Adam just trapped inside that big power plant torture device in his own vision of a different future.
It's called marriage.
Great 80s stand-up material.
What's the deal? Why don't you make the whole plane out of the black box?
our last-minute guest, Jerry Seinfeld, everybody on the show. And also, please subscribe to us on iTunes and all the different podcast platforms like Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean app, YouTube. Most places where podcasts are potentially available, and rate and review us to give the show more visibility so we can get out of this dystopian hell that is our, especially ratings and reviews. We don't have that many.
Yeah, come on, man. Anything. I'd be happy with being voted the worst podcast at this point.
That's true. That might drive attention as well. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Though that's not to decry anybody who has rated and reviewed us as well. We thank you and we appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yes. And now we will finally get this to an end here with our picks for next week. So next week, in honor of the movie Us coming out from Jordan Peele, which I'm extremely excited about.
Yeah, me too, man. I'm super, super interested.
I can't fucking wait. But we decided in honor of that, which is a movie in which Lupita Nyong'o and her family go off to their lake house and find home invaders that look very familiar. They are played by themselves, so it's a whole double acting thing going on there. We decided to do an episode about films in which people play multiple roles, which, to be fair, this would count for anything where at least one actor plays two roles, potentially. It doesn't have to just be like a Nutty Professor level, everyone is played by the same actor. No, not necessarily. But Adam has the two good movies, I have the two bad movies, and as I stated before, the whole gimmick of our show is we don't know what the two movies are from each other, except that they fit into the specific category. And we each pick a number between 1 and 10, and whatever number gets closest to numbers the other has assigned to their two movies, that ends up being our good or bad pick. So for me, Adam, in your two choices, I will pick the number 3.
At number 3, with a bullet, I have Christopher Nolan's The Prestige.
Okay. Wow, that's a bit of a spoiler for that movie if you haven't seen it.
Well, yeah, but if you haven't seen it, then, get off your fucking couch. Don't go see it. Stay on your couch. Rent the movie.
That's true. It's over 10 years old. You should see it this way. It's an underrated Christopher Nolan movie, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. At number 7, I had last year's Suspiria.
Right, whereas Tilda Swinton plays at least 3 different roles, including a man, and she's quite
great. At least. I'm convinced there's like 5 other ones that we just haven't spotted.
She was actually Dakota Johnson as well.
Yeah, I believe it.
Well, now, Adam, for my 2 movies.
Okay, before I pick, I'm going to tell you right now that there's one that I have in my head that if you picked it, I'm going to quit.
Ooh, tension.
I want to go number 5, right in the middle.
Well, at number 4, I had a movie that we've kind of referenced before on this show, and I think is incredibly fascinating as a movie. It is a vanity project from 1991, Nothing But Trouble.
Oh, that is not what I thought, and I don't hate that movie. So I'm sitting pretty. What was your other choice?
My other choice was at number 7. I had Nutty Professor 2, The Clumps.
Oh, neither were my choice. I thought you were going to pick fucking North with Elijah Wood.
No. I'm not going to inflict that on myself. No.
Yeah. I'm like, he's going to get me back for Death Race. Ooh. So Nothing But Trouble and The Prestige. Well, that's going to be interesting.
That'll definitely be very interesting, and we look forward to having that discussion next week, and for all you all to tune into that. But until next time, we gotta fly off into the sky with our big bird wings, Adam. Let's go!
Long live the Tooch.
Good night.
Good night.